views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of Bronxnet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. The ink still drying news today is that the state budget deal that was signed just before the deadline of April 1st, while it includes highly charged items like congestion pricing, a so-called mansion tax, and a plastic bag ban, tonight's guests are particularly interested in the budgetary considerations for campaign financing, which included a bit of a punt down the field for a one day to be determined situation. We'll talk about that on our program tonight. Also, tonight's guests can break down the role and effect money has in decision making, and in particular, decisions made on energy and climate change. These are important core topics about the nature and effectiveness of our democracy, for sure. Please join me in welcoming on the phone the senior campaign strategist for DEMOS, a national organization that works for racial, social, and economic justice, Umshula Jayaram. Nice to have you with us.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. And the lead campaign strategist on climate equity from DEMOS, he's in the studio. Adrian Salazar, nice to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
Umshula, let's start with you. Just prior to the program, you characterized what had happened in Albany as a big defeat. And I'll just state what happened, and then you can characterize why you thought it was a defeat for campaign financing. Basically, the governor and state legislature decided to set up a commission that would gather information and then by December release a report that would talk about campaign financing and all the other issues that are related to it. Why do you say that's a defeat? Sounds like they're moving it forward, no?
So, Gary, obviously, of course, I'm speaking just on behalf of DEMOS and not on behalf of the coalition, but I think we were all pretty devastated by yesterday's outcome because, the coalition had made some very simple, basic asks to be codified into law, including a campaign finance system with a 6-to-1 matching ratio, an independent agency to administer the program fairly, and lower contribution limits. And we said, okay, if you guys really want to have a commission, if you feel like there are a lot of details that still need to be worked out, that's fine, but let's just get these three things into law. And so now, because, at a minimum, at least we got the fact that they have to create a system. They can't not create it. But virtually everything else is being left up to this commission, which is, will be appointed by leadership from the executive, the assembly, and the Senate, which, frankly, I think, at least from my perspective, I don't have a lot of confidence that the commissioners are going to be advocates for a robust system of campaign finance. And I also feel that really essentially what this does is force us to continue to lobby this campaign, right? Because...
No, go ahead. Finish your statement, and then I will break in with a question.
Basically because none of the parameters have been set. And even if the commission does come out with some recommendations, they have the force of law unless the legislature decides to change something. So it feels, really like nothing has actually been done here.
Right.
And I'll stop in a second, but, one of the things that Zephyr Teachout pointed out was like, they could come up with a 2-to-1 matching ratio, right? Which is not going to entice people to opt into this system.
Let me break in now. You basically have suggested where I wanted to go with this, and that is budget time the best time to get this kind of reform, or is this kind of reform better suited for a legislative debate, which in essence is what is coming up now, because yes, it came out of the budget, because when you get in the middle of this budget discussion, that just like I said at the top of the show, they're talking about congestion pricing, they're talking about education funding and all these other things, and then it's just like, well, we want to apportion this amount of money, and they don't give kind of the seriousness to the nuance of the issues, whether a 6-to-1 match or a 2-to-1 match is better, and what is better for the system. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, maybe that is the best forum to handle this, and that had they started earlier and had all that dialogue, in the fall, they'd have been ready for April. But once you get in the middle of this budget crunch, it becomes very hard to overhaul, a package like that.
I think it's a great point that you're making, Gary. I do think that there is this particular campaign has pointed out, and actually many of the others this session have highlighted once again how problematic it is to have sort of everything but the kitchen sink be put into
the
this
budget,
budget bill. So we essentially have 3 months to make all of the most important decisions. Because there is a price tag on this system, it had to be done through the budget. But again, that means it's competing with a million other things, and there's a short runway.
Right.
But the thing I would push back on really is that campaign finance is not. We're not reinventing the wheel. Connecticut has had a statewide system for more than a decade. And currently, at least as of 2012, I think 77% of sitting lawmakers had opted into the program and successfully won office. So we know that it can work, and there were a lot of very substantive policy discussions during hearings, during lobby visits, all of that stuff. There was also a report that came out from the Campaign Finance Institute in December that sort of did a breakdown of how the system could work statewide. So, to me, I don't believe that a lack of information was really the problem.
Right.
And if it truly was, and there are things that I am not giving enough credence to, then they still could have met our 3 asks, which were fairly limited, right, but would have been a powerful step forward and meant that the core, the heart and soul of campaign finance would have been codified,
right.
And then the other details the commission could work out.
I want to. I'm going to give you both sides of the coin. I think the most cogent point you mentioned along the way was that if you appoint the commission, and the commission is appointed by the same people who have been structured, who kind of been maybe somewhat resistant to campaign finance reform, then, how strong a commission is it going to be? It's like the Moreland Commission that we had recently. But then on the other side, on the point that I made, I look at a list of all the election reforms that we had passed by the legislature, because there is now a Democratic majority in the Senate. Early voting, no excuse absentee voting, expanding voter registration, all that was passed. So, I wonder if in this climate, I don't want to say you'd be better off, but it is interesting to consider that a legislative debate on this might actually serve your purposes. Interesting thought.
Well, but Gary, we did have debates. We had several hearings. We had months where the advocacy community was pounding the pavement, lobbying on this issue, talking it through with lawmakers. I mean, I just don't know what else they wanted, and the fear is that, as you said before, that this massive punt will sort of take all of the air out of it, in addition to leaving it up to people who it's not in their interest to do a robust system.
Well, so I would, my response to that would be to say, given the nature of dialogues I've had in setting up this program with you and others, I'm guessing you're not going anywhere. So I'm not so sure that it's not going to happen. Anyway, let me bring Mr. Salazar into the equation. And before we get directly into climate change, and this is a philosophical thing that applies to both campaign finance and the suggestion of money in environmental policy, is how definitive is the question of whether money affects decisions. Now, I'll tell you, Carl Hastie, the Speaker of the Assembly, was on this program, and then I saw the same quote in the Daily News, and he said, and I remember he said it right here in this program and again in the Daily News recently, I've never in my life, me personally, never let a contribution motivate what my ideals and principles are. Of course, he didn't specifically say that he never voted that way, although on this program he did say that. So the question is, and I talked to an Assembly member prior to this show, and he said, if I get a $2,500 contribution, I got to tell you, that doesn't mean I'm automatically going to approve a project. And he talked about he said, I got contributions from both sides on a health care issue. And he said, so it does, it's like, how did it influence me? So we'll let Mr. Salazar deal with that. How definitive are we that at the local level, we can talk the national level, contributions to campaigns really determine how electeds vote?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question, Gary. And I think in the realm of environmental and energy policy for New York State, we have a couple of examples of policies where people have been pushing. And in the mid-2010s, folks were fighting to ban and put restrictions on gas fracking, fractured gas development in the state. And we saw in that campaign in 2007 to 2014, the fracked gas and support industries pump in millions of dollars in campaign contributions and lobbying to resist the policies that environmental groups and their allies all across the state were trying to push for in Albany. And this had an effect. There were several proposals that were on the floor, and many of them did not get through.
Didn't we ultimately get a ban on fracking?
Through executive action, yes. And that's what I was just going to land on, right? That ultimately, because the governor decided that it was a priority for him and his administration, that they would ban fracking in the state of New York, which is an excellent outcome for that campaign. But this actually is a pattern of how, the fossil fuel industry, which when we think of the influence of money in politics here in New York and nationally, operates everywhere, where they face threats to their industry from really strong policy that would bring us to a more renewable energy economy and to actually addressing climate change.
Can the issue that you're concerned about is that the influence of money in climate change issues and frankly in larger, and there's no larger issue than that, in other issues, can legislation affect that? In other words, how do you change that? And I know that many advocates say, you know what, we're never going to change climate change unless we can take the money out of politics. But what needs to be done, whether it's in campaign financing or other rules that might affect the issue that you're concerned about?
Yeah, and I think you're right to address the scale of the challenge of climate change. And I think when we talk about what Amshul has brought to the table about campaign finance reform and a specific issue like climate change, this is something that campaign finance reform touches most definitely, and so with the case with many other issues, right? In the environmental field specifically, we know that the reality of climate change is affecting thousands of people's lives across the country today, right? In wildfires, hurricanes,
I would say thousands is an understatement.
Exactly.
Millions, maybe tens and hundreds of millions.
Exactly.
But that's another story.
Exactly. And the science on the reality of climate change, there's no actual scientific debate on this. There is a consensus that it is happening, that the window for action is narrowing. That what we also know is that we have the technology and the technical knowledge that we need to begin a transition to a renewable energy economy, to begin drawing down carbon from the atmosphere that's causing global warming. What we know then, if we have the technology, if we have a support from public opinion that climate change is real and that we need government action, where's the problem? It's a political problem. We have the influence of large industries like fossil fuel industry pumping millions of dollars into campaigns against strong policies that would actually bring us to where we need to be to address climate change.
Do you view this as a separate issue nationally versus locally, specifically in the state? Maybe less so in the city. Obviously, there are things we can do in New York City, but I'm talking the state. In other words, there's obviously major fossil fuel money going into national campaigns, and not necessarily as much of that money. I mean, there may be development money going into state campaigns. Talk to me about if there is a difference between how this would work in state governments, specifically New York, and the national governments.
It would definitely help us in moving stronger environmental and climate policies in the state of New York. We know, for example, that Governor Cuomo in the last election for his re-election received over $100,000 from fossil fuel companies. And
this would make him less likely to do what?
I, as an environmental advocate, want a governor and elected officials who will take the problem of climate change, who we know who the culprits are, seriously, right? And I think it's very difficult for a politician to say that I am for strong climate solutions when we know that they are receiving tens of thousands of dollars from the companies that are contributing to that problem.
And again, I guess drawing a direct comparison in some cases might be more or less difficult depending on who it is. So in terms of a legislative action, is it lowering maximum contributions? I mean, what specific legislation do you think can impact this, and then what would be the process to go through that?
I think Amshula can answer that question because she's worked really in the weeds with this campaign. I think in terms of how robust reforms for democracy, including the ones that you already listed that the legislature passed, and in addition to campaign finance reform, what that would do is actually increase the power of constituents, of people like you and me, to have conversations with our elected officials about the issues we care about. And when we know that polling in the state of New York shows that a vast majority of New Yorkers support government action to address climate change, and that we know that the action we need needs to be aggressive in order to actually reach a renewable energy economy, then if we implement a lot of those reforms in our democracy, in campaign finance, we know that the voices of the people who are making small donations that would be amplified, by public finance.
Amshula, let's then throw it to you then, and I will just mention that in the borough of the Bronx, regardless of which way campaign monies have flowed, there has been a renewed effort toward green economies, toward green construction. Every building that is now approved and built in the Bronx has to have green components. We now have solar farms that are exploding in the Bronx. And yet, you could still trace campaign donations from some of these entities that Mr. Salazar is talking about, and so equalize the issue for me and explain to me what kind of legislation would work. But if in fact in the Bronx we're getting that effort, where are we at? I guess is what I'm really asking.
Sure. I also wanted to just quickly address to the point you made earlier, Gary, when the assembly member who said, it doesn't affect my decision making. I guess I would just push back to say, well, if it doesn't influence decision making, then why do companies donate, right? Like, is it charity? What are they giving these millions of dollars for if not to influence decision making? So I think incentives are a pretty straightforward concept that we all understand, and it seems a little, I don't know, a little ridiculous to me to say that you can accept these huge donations and not be influenced at any level by those donations.
So you don't accept that. But let's just address what legislation specifically. I know that you want the matching funds so that smaller donors can have greater influence, and that's what we just heard. But what kind of, are we talking about lowering maximums?
Well, so the three things that the coalition has been focused on, so in addition to, closing the LLC loophole so that you can't make multiple LLCs and just donate through the same thing, increased transparency around donors, that's really important so we know where the money's actually coming from. But then these three core elements that we've been pushing for, which ultimately did not get codified, which is the 6-to-1 matching rate, lowering contribution limits, and creating an independent agency to run the program so that it can be administered well and fairly. Because the other fear I have, to be honest with you, is that if they glom it onto an existing state agency who can't handle it and is also a state agency, right? So it's sort of beholden to the state. It'll be a mess of a program, and then they'll be able to come back to us and say, hey, look, we told you it couldn't work, and it doesn't work. So those are really the three things that I think need to be codified into law. We cannot do anything about existing jurisprudence, about Citizens United. What we have been trying to stress is that a small donor matching system and, lowering contribution limits, because New York has some of the highest in the country, will be a way for the people to push back. We can't, again, cancel out what the Supreme Court has said, but we can give ordinary people the opportunity to participate in a more powerful way. You're basically making citizens 6 times as powerful, right? Because their donation can go that much further. And you can also free lawmakers up from being sort of held back by money, right? Because it's a problem for them too.
Let me ask you two questions. Number one, the 6-to-1 is an interesting question. Of course, that money has to come from somewhere. And I would just, in the research that I did, showed me two numbers. One was that the whole cost of public financing of campaigns might be $500 million. But then I saw very recently, and again, this is late breaking news, so it had to come out this morning, is that the commitment was going to be for $100 million. Do you have a dollar amount of what it would cost the state of New York and taxpayers to do what you're suggesting? And then I'll follow up with a legislative question to answer, to get to the other part of it.
Sure. So the $500 million is a number that the speaker has put out in a number of different articles and so on. And frankly, it's kind of a mystery as to where that number has come from, because it's much, much, much higher than the estimates from, for instance, the Campaign Finance Institute, which is a nonpartisan institute that has studied campaign finance reform for a long time. The estimates from Michael Malvin's report, who is the director of the Campaign Finance Institute, is between 40 to 60 million annually, and over 4 years. And then his breakdown was that it would come to less than $3 a day per New Yorker per year.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump in because I do want to ask Mr. Salazar a question before we run out of time. So my follow-up was really, I guess, more a statement. Seems to me, through this dialogue, through the research I've done preparing for this show, if we could just, we hear about every campaign, the mayoral campaign, the governor's campaign, obviously the presidential campaign, it keeps costing more and more. This was the most expensive campaign in history. You're not going to get one that was the cheapest campaign. Seems to me if we could tamp down and all of the monies and lower the whole cost of running an election, we probably will be better off. That's my editorial comment based on what I heard. Can I assume you agree with that? That was for you, Amsala.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, absolutely.
In other words, if we could no longer have to say this was the most expensive campaign in history, I think we'd be better off. But let's let Mr. Salazar weigh in here. Just look at the whole of climate change and the whole of addressing it. I've already talked about how in the Bronx, where I think there's a genuine attempt and a genuine understanding it's something we need to do. What are the steps that you see that would actually change things, and aside from the politics of it, but I'm talking about actually converting our systems so that we kind of adhere to the available science.
Yeah, so in addition to...
And let me just add, and not hurt Americans financially and keep them in jobs and keep them working. That's been the main thing. We need the jobs. Well, you could have jobs the other way. That's my contention.
I'm going to start answering your question by talking about public finance of campaigns again, right? Which is that all of the reforms that we're talking about in our democracy that we're trying to implement, the AMSHLA and the Coalition for Finance Reform has been interested in, are about bringing more people to the table about decision making. And in the realm of climate change policy, we actually have a proposal on the table that does that in New York State. The Climate and Community Protection Act is a bill that's right now moving through the legislature that that would, if passed, put New York State on a path to 100% renewable energy economy-wide by 2050. And it does a couple other things. It targets investments in the communities that would be most impacted by climate change, that are historically impacted by the burdens of pollution, like many communities here in the Bronx.
We certainly would know that in the Bronx.
Yes, absolutely, where you have some of the highest rates of asthma in the country. And it also creates strong labor standards for jobs that would be created in the renewable energy transition. Some of the studies that we've shown demonstrate that for the state of New York, this would create 150,000 jobs per year, at least in the first 10 years, in bringing more solar energy, more wind energy, building
So for
retrofits.
you, that's the first step. That is a good.
Yeah,
Listen,
we got to codify into law the goals that we want for New York State to be able to reduce its emissions.
We could spend another half hour talking about the rest of the issues, but Adrian Salazar from Demos, thank you so much. And Amshala Jayaram, also from Demos, all the way over there on the telephone. We do appreciate your time today, and thank you both for fighting for what you believe in. It's probably the most important aspect of our democracy.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Great. Folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org. You can send us a tweet at BronxTalk or post them on our Facebook page. We thank our producers, Helen Greenberg. The directors are William Guzman and Nick Marrero. We will see you next week. Good night.